Welcome to Friday's programme.
First tonight, it was a day of anger and emotion. A day when bereaved parents were able to hear firsthand Tony Blair's account of why we went to war in Iraq.
Well, among those with the ticket to the Chilcot inquiry, Roger Bacon from Suffolk, who lost his son Matthew in the conflict 5 years ago.
He was looking for answers as the former Prime Minister gave evidence. Malcolm Robertson reports now on a harrowing day for all involved.
Throughout his political life, he'd been used to being in the spotlight, but Tony Blair had surely never been under as close scrutiny as this. Hours of questions as to why he took Britain to war in 2003. Outside the Iraq inquiry in Westminster, there was anger among anti-war protesters that the former Prime Minister had entered through a back door. Roger Bacon had his pass checked as he prepared to go through the front door. He lives at Woodbridge in Suffolk, and as the father of a soldier killed in Iraq in 2005, he was keen to hear Mr. Blair's justification for military action against Saddam Hussein.
The decision I took, and frankly would take again, if there was any possibility that he could develop weapons of mass destruction, we should stop him. That was my view. That was my view then, that's my view now.
Earlier this week, Roger Bacon spoke to Anglia News about the Iraq War and about the sense of pride he felt in his son, Major Matthew Bacon. He was in the intelligence corps and was killed by a roadside bomb in Basra.
Having lost a wonderful son in this conflict, it just makes me so angry. My own opinion is that we should not have gone to war. I've always felt that. I've always felt that it was the wrong war. And so for me, the blame lies at the head, and it lies with Blair.
Among the other British military personnel from our region killed during the most recent conflict in Iraq, Staff Sergeant Simon Cullingworth of 33 Engineer Regiment Bomb Disposal, who was from Essex. Fusilier Keelan Turrington, the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers from Cambridgeshire. Corporal Paul Long of the Royal Military Police from Colchester. Trooper Carl Smith of the 9th 12th Royal Lancers, he was born in Kettering. Staff Sergeant Sharon Elliott of the Intelligence Corps from Hadley in Suffolk. WO2 Lee Hopkins of the Royal Corps of Signals from Wellingborough. And serving with the SAS, Corporal Lee Fitzsimmons from Peterborough. Their families, and also the families of many of those who fought in Iraq, were looking for answers as to why Britain took part in what they regarded as an illegal war. At today's inquiry, Mr. Blair denied agreeing a covert deal with George Bush to go to war when they met in the United States in 2002. For Roger Bacon, this was a day that allowed him to come face to face with Tony Blair in the inquiry room.
I would say it was the most devastating thing that could ever happen to any family. And could he not think about how he would have reacted if his son had had to go to Iraq?
Even by his standards, it was an extraordinary day for Tony Blair. Outside the inquiry, the prevailing mood remained emotional and angry. Malcolm Robertson, Anglia News.
Another difficult day for all the bereaved relatives there.
The man on trial for murdering a colleague whose dismembered body was found scattered across Hertfordshire and Leicestershire has today changed his plea to guilty.
38-year-old Stephen Marshall has now admitted killing Geoffrey Howe last year. Well, our correspondent Neil Bradford joins us from St Albans Crown Court. Neil, an unexpected turn of events then.
Yeah, Stephen Marshall had been due to give evidence here at St Albans Crown Court earlier in the week, but there was no need for him to take the stand in the end because this morning he changed his plea on the charge of murder to guilty. Now, at the start of this trial 3 weeks ago, he admitted dismembering and disposing of his colleague Geoffrey Howe's body in an act the prosecution claimed was motivated by sheer greed. It's one of the most gruesome murders detectives in Hertfordshire have ever had to investigate. Parts of Geoffrey Howe's dismembered body were dumped at locations across the county. 3 weeks ago at the start of this trial, Stephen Marshall admitted cutting up and disposing of his body, but denied murder. In a dramatic turn of events here at St Albans Crown Court this morning, Stephen Marshall changed his plea. As the murder charge was put to him once again, he replied, "Guilty, my lord." Geoffrey Howe was Marshall's colleague. The 49-year-old kitchen salesman had rented a room to him and his girlfriend Sarah Bush at this flat in Southgate, North London. During the trial, the court heard how Marshall had refused to pay rent and then refused to move out. The prosecution claimed he had hatched a plan to murder his colleague so he could steal his identity and possessions. A plan he enacted around the 8th or 9th of March last year by stabbing Mr. Howe to death. The jury was told how Marshall and his 21-year-old girlfriend began to use Mr. Howe's bank account as soon as he was murdered. They sold his car on eBay and began spending his money on clothes, shoes, food and other goods. In the weeks that followed, Geoffrey Howe's remains were discovered by members of the public across Hertfordshire. The macabre finds began on March the 22nd last year beside the A507 at Cottered with the discovery of his left leg. His right leg was dumped by the A10 at Puckeridge on the 7th of April. His torso and right arm were found a few days later at Standon. His left arm had been discovered on the 29th of March near Wheat Hampstead. His dismembered head was dumped in a field miles away at Asfordby in Leicestershire. At the start of the trial, Marshall pleaded guilty to dismembering and disposing of Mr. Howe's body and misleading the police during a missing persons inquiry. His partner and co-defendant, Sarah Bush, continues to deny all charges. Marshall will be sentenced at a later date. Neil Bradford, Anglia News, St Albans Crown Court.
No, it was an horrific attack that went unsolved for almost 20 years. But thanks to advances in DNA technology, the guilty man is now behind bars.
50-year-old Phil Collins from Ipswich was today found guilty of raping a 17-year-old girl in 1990. In sentencing, the judge described it as a wicked crime. Victoria Webb is in court.
For almost 2 decades, 50-year-old Phil Collins from Ipswich has been a free man living with a dark secret. Back in 1990, he was the sex attacker Suffolk police were trying to trace after a 17-year-old girl was raped and indecently assaulted. It happened on a January night at Gipswick Park in Ipswich. Collins waited for his victim, and when she passed him, he threatened her with a knife, dragged her behind a hut and subjected her to an horrendous ordeal. Now, all these years later, he's finally behind bars.
Obviously it brings an element of closure for her, but she is delighted to know that the person has been identified, who of course for 19 years, that given the offender was masked, she never even knew what he looked like, and that's a terrifying thing really to deal with for 19 years.
The conviction comes as a result of a cold case investigation. Although the victim's clothing had been destroyed, laboratory slides taken at the time had been stored all these years. In 2008, scientists found a DNA match after Collins' son was put on the national database due to a shoplifting offence. A DNA profile was created and found to match Phil Collins on a probability of 1 in a billion.
We've moved from a position where in the early sort of 90s that we had to have a amount of blood that was about the size of 50p piece. Now we've moved on to a position where not only can we discriminate between people much more effectively, we only need blood stains, say, the size of less than a pinhead to work with.
The court heard how Collins had previous convictions for indecent exposure, the first 4 years after the 17-year-old girl was attacked. It involved him exposing himself and approaching a woman at night. The second came a year later after a female reported a man entering her garden, once again exposing himself and looking through the curtain. In sentencing today, the judge described the 1990 attack as an evil crime and sentenced Collins to a total of 46 years for rape and 4 other sexual offences. He'll serve a maximum of 10 as the jail terms will run concurrently.
The police will always continue to investigate them, and working with the Forensic Science Service and other partners, with the advances in science and technology, it is only a matter of time before you are caught.
Tonight, almost 20 years after subjecting a teenager to a terrifying attack, she has justice and Collins is finally beginning to pay for his crime. Victoria Webb, Anglia News, Ipswich.
Now, the manager